So that's really where we have to factor that in. We want to balance living a quality life now and not over sacrificing today. But at the same time, we don't want to be outliving assets. So longevity is a key component of the whole conversation. Welcome to Tell Your Boss I Quit with me, Pete Gutekunst, the podcast where we help you financially bridge from where you've started to the life goals you've imagined. Hey, Jason, what's on your mind?
Well, today I would like to talk about some mistakes that people over 50 make, or that they're approaching their 50s, that they make when they're planning for their retirement, specifically with life expectancy. So I know a lot of financial planners don't approach it this way, but I have a question about life expectancy, trends and predictions. How do you play that into your planning, and how can the demographic trends and personal health factors influence life expectancy predictions?
Yeah, the life expectancy is really a big part of the calculation. And I'll tell you, the financial planners, we always want to guard against what happens if you live too long. People will say, oh, I'm never going to live that long, and why should I worry about it? But that's the first risk, is we're going to worry about that. If you die too soon, you're not going to run out of money. You're not going to outlive your money. So that's not the challenge. The challenge is, what if you live too long? So from a calculation standpoint, we want to start there. But how can affect your planning? Some people have known healthcare conditions right now. They know that they might have a different life expectancy than something that might be considered traditional, or maybe even a little bit extended. On the other hand, we have people who know that they have a lot of longevity. We see more and more people living up to and past age 100 than we've seen in, past many years. That seems to be more common. And so that's really part of the equation. One is, we're always going to assume statistically a husband and wife, one of you is expected to live into your early 90s. That's pretty much a given. So we're going to start there. You have longevity, and maybe we should even prepare longer. If you have a health condition and there's some reason to guard against or prepare a little bit less, we're always going to be more concerned about what if you live too long. That's the risk we want to focus on.
Talking about living too long, based upon your past experience.
It's horrible, doesn't it? Living too long. Live, let's say, say you live a good life. You live too, not too long, but you live longer than maybe what you thought you were going to live at age 60. How's that sound? But anyway, I didn't interrupt your question.
Well, you live longer than your money. That's where living too long comes into play.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a better way of saying it. Sure.
So that kind of brings up the question here, so what are the financial risks of underestimating the, life expectancy in retirement planning?
It's interesting. The longevity is really, I think, the biggest risk that you're facing. And so we need to incorporate that into a plan. And inflation is going to be a big part of that. The longer you live, the more length of time you're going to be exposed to greater inflation. And the things that cost more in life, healthcare being one of them, tend to have a higher rate of inflation. So the risk of longevity isn't just outliving your money, but the very things that you might spend your money on are rising at a higher rate of inflation. And that's what we need to guard against. And so it's quite common to run numbers and see, hey, looks like you get to your middle 80s and you're strong and have even more net worth than when you started in retirement. And it's those next 10 or 15 years where you really start to see the potential of spending down assets, because some of those lifetime expenses will really be ramping up, or the newer expenses, your healthcare expenses, will be greater. So that's really where we have to factor that in. We want to balance living a quality life now and not over sacrificing today. But at the same time, we don't want to be outliving assets. So longevity is a key component of the whole conversation.
When we're talking about longevity, running out of savings, due to living longer, that right there is something that I'm sure that a lot of people are afraid of, because I don't want to spend too much and run out, but I also want to enjoy my life. So how do we approach that from a planning aspect?
We'll look at a lot of times, or really the key is to look at what your withdrawal rate is. And what I mean by a withdrawal rate is, if you have $1 million and you're taking 4% out of $1 million, you're withdrawing $40,000 a year. And so is that sustainable? Well, with a modest rate of inflation and expected spending over time, that might be a good starting point to say, look, it appears as though that could be something sustainable. And if you think about it, if you're investing in a manner where maybe you're making 6, 7, 8% on an annualized basis over a long period of time, you should be seeing that your net worth is still growing even while you're withdrawing, or at the very least is maintaining itself so that you're maintaining those assets far later into life. You're not diminishing your assets. So withdrawal rate is a good starting point because it's quite possible, if even likely, that when we talk about longevity and we're at a much advanced age into your 90s, and now there are these large healthcare expenses or things like that, that could be a dramatically higher expense and you could have a much higher withdrawal rate. But if you preserved your wealth as best as manageable, you're able to handle that situation. So that's the balancing act, is you don't want to be taking out 10% and say, hey, I've been invested in the stock market. The average of the stock market might be 10%. I can handle that. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. It's just not a sustainable withdrawal rate. And that's really what we want to focus on, is how sustainable and predictable is the plan in order to give you the confidence to not overdoing it now, but at the same token, you're not over-sacrificing.
Obviously you work with a lot of clients, and when you're having initial conversations with them, they might be, in their 40s or 50s, but then they're thinking to themselves internally, hey, I really only expect to live to be 85. Next thing you know, they're 103 or something,
Yeah.
right? So when we're talking about the retirement funds, specifically, 85 to 103 is a big stretch. So what are some strategies that we can do in case we actually live longer than we truly expect to live?
Well, it starts with good planning on the front end. Is you don't want to, be 85 and start doing your planning for what if I live till I'm 95, obviously. And that's really why this question of longevity on the front end is so important. Is I've met a number of people who say, my parents only lived to be 81, 2 or 3 or something like that. And we meet a lot of people who just can't believe that they're going to live as long as they probably are. And yet the lifespans are much greater today. Like I said, a couple who, is expected, one of the two of them is expected into their 90s. So if you're retiring at, say, 62, 65, you're probably going to be retired for 30 years. So that's really where it starts, is on the front end. Are we prepared for a 30 plus year retirement? And as we approach that and we see where things are headed when you're 70, 75, and 80, that would be how you're guarding against that, up until your age 85. Is this going to be a sustainable withdrawal rate? Is this going to be a sustainable flow of income? And are there things that you're going to have to consider doing, using equity from your house or things along those lines as contingency plans would be, what you'd have to be prepared for. And that's really where the conversation goes as you approach that. But I would say on the front end, if we're doing good planning and we're starting out with a reasonable withdrawal rate, we can typically manage through that time frame.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, living longer than expected, that same 85 to 103 scenario. I've never seen a situation where the cost of healthcare goes down over time. It always goes up. And so when we're trying to plan for the longevity, how does healthcare costs come into that planning ratio, or that the strategy that you're using with your clients to make sure that they're covered for that? Are there any kind of instruments that you're recommending that they purchase, or is it all about investing? Are there insurances that they can go with? I guess the list could go on. I'll let you answer that.
Well, healthcare is the one big number I think that we all have to wrestle with. And the lifetime expense of what a couple will spend on their health insurance is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, even your Medicare Part B premiums, that's a monthly expense right now of about $175 per person per month. And if you're living for 30 years, that adds up to, some significant numbers. And it's also increasing at a higher rate of inflation. Just your medical expenses. If you need to get assisted living or skilled nursing care or care in your own home, those things are very expensive, and they do increase at least as much as, if not a greater rate of inflation. So that's really an area we want to be protected against. And that goes back to that. You don't want to be drawing your assets down and, bouncing your last check, so to speak. That's what I used to call the perfect financial plan. But imagine that's what happens, only now you need need some more significant health care at that stage of life. That's really what we want to be protected and guarded against along the way.
Okay, I can't imagine that most of the clients you work with are actually relying on Social Security for their retirement, for their primary retirement income. So let's talk about some strategies about tapping into Social Security. How does that play into retirement planning?
Yeah, Social Security is not an insignificant source of income, though. You're right. It's not the primary source. It's not the one that you rely on. But on the other hand, if you think about the value of an investment that would generate the same income or cash flow that you're going to get from Social Security, if you live this 30-year post-retirement lifespan, it's a significant amount of money. It's a significant value. And so how do you maximize that? Well, one is if you reach your full retirement age every year after full retirement age. So if you were born before 1960, you're going to be 66 and some change of months. If you were born after 1960, your full retirement age is going to be age 67. So every year you delay up to age 70, you're going to get an increase in your income of 8%. So that's not a bad bump. So if you can manage to delay Social Security, you can get a nice kick in your start. And that higher income, if you live that 30-year lifespan that we're talking about in retirement, you're building and getting cost of living adjustments on that. So that's a way to really try to maximize the income. And on the other hand, if you're a spouse, spouses do not get that same. So if you're electing a spousal benefit, delaying the spousal benefit, because you can claim on a spouse's income, if you if you take your full retirement age income then, it's not going to increase by the time you're 70. So you might want to turn that one on. So you're kind of putting the two together. The point here simply is we typically, when we run the numbers and we look at longevity, and I always say financial planning, we look for and plan for and guard against and concern ourselves with living too long. We want to start with that. That's the big risk. So we're going to get the most income if we delay Social Security. Now, what if you don't have that longevity in your life or something along those lines? That might be a reason to start a little bit sooner. What if your assets aren't really sufficient to provide the bridge from the point at which you're going to retirement until your max Social Security age at, say, 70? Those all play into it. But we'll start with that and say, how long can we delay Social Security? Because when we run those numbers, typically we have the highest net worth when a person is, say, age 85, because they're getting the most from Social Security from age 70 to age 85, which means they're theoretically then withdrawing less from their investments that they otherwise would have. And that's really where it's so critical. So we do play with that. What if you retire and take Social Security a little sooner? What happens if you delay? And then I always talk about the purpose and making decisions that are right for you. So we can crunch numbers and be very analytical and say, here's the solution. This is the best number. And you have to live with that decision. You have to feel comfortable with that. So for some people, that's not taking Social Security until they're 70, but there may be a few years when they're taking money out of their investments more so than they're comfortable with, knowing that they're going to flip on Social Security just in a few short years away. That might not sit well with an individual. And that's important because all of these good numbers, all of these good calculations, all of this great advice, if you can't follow through with it, it's going to unwind your financial plan. And so you have to be able to have a good plan, but you also have to be able to execute and follow through on that plan. So at that point, it might be, well, what if I didn't do that? What if I went a little earlier? How much of a difference does it make? How much does it help me? And so those are the conversations I think you want to have to make an informed decision rather than just running the numbers through and saying this one's better than that one. There's a lot more to the equation.
So when somebody maximizes the amount that they can pull out of Social Security and they've already done well with you with their investment and their planning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does this sound like a good strategy? If I were 70 and I were to take that money that I don't need, but I'm taking that income, where would you suggest that I put that money to make it grow as I continue with that anticipation of possibly living longer than our initial plan?
Well, think about it in terms of the time horizon of the investment. So if we have put ourselves in a position where we can withdraw less, then what that's really another way of saying that is we've extended the time horizon on the investment because we don't need to withdraw as much or at all from that investment because we've increased or maximized the income from another source. And so by having that longer time horizon, it gives us the ability to invest more in perhaps stocks and bonds than if we needed to take a lot out in a shorter period of time. So it really maneuvers or moves around our time horizon, and it just gives us the opportunity to explore different types of investment strategies that do well over time versus strategies that do well every single month or every single year. That's, the least risky investment is going to give us the lowest return. But if we need money pretty soon, that's the investment that you need. If you have a 3 and a 5-year time horizon, you're going to have a very different opportunity set of investment strategies. And so that's really what it comes down to is first, what do you need coming in? And then where's it going to come from? Some of it's going to come from Social Security. So what's the difference? Where's that going to come from? Some people still have pensions. Some people don't retire. I refer to it as re-inspirement. Some people go and do something new and they still have a little bit of income, even though they're, quote, retired. So now they've got Social Security, a little bit of income. And that's the difference then we need to make up from investments. All of those things drive the time horizon of what you need and how much you need. And I'll come back to the withdrawal rate I talked about. Those also may lower the withdrawal rate. So if we have a very low withdrawal rate, we can afford to have longer term investments. If we have a little bit of a higher withdrawal rate, we need to moderate the investment asset allocation. That's all really going to drive all of those decisions.
When you're talking about the withdrawal rate, are you talking about the Social Security withdrawal rate?
No, I mean the withdrawal rate from your investment. So if you have $1 million and you're taking out 40,000, that's a 4% withdrawal rate. If you have 100,000 and you're taking out 4,000, that's a 4% withdrawal rate. If you're taking out 80,000, that's an 8% withdrawal rate. So that's a high number. If you're taking out 8% and you're in a moderate investment, some years you're going to get 8. Some years you're going to get more than 8, but you're going to expect to have a lot of years where you're not going to quite get 8 and maybe even get a negative number. And it's going to be really hard to make up that shortfall because you're still going to need to withdraw 8% if that's in fact where your withdrawal rate is. Now, if you're only taking out 4%, well, maybe you have a year where you make a lot more than 4. Maybe you have a year where you have a negative return. But over time, it smooths out and you're probably growing or would like to believe that you're growing more than the amount that you're withdrawing over time. And that's a sustainable, manageable withdrawal rate. And you can afford to be invested in a moderate type of portfolio that can sustain that. The risk is when we have the bad market experiences and they are negative, you can't be overexposed to a big drop, but you also need to be able to, have that opportunity in the long run. So really, we're kind of managing your asset allocation of your investments, and that is going to be determined by all of your income sources: Social Security, part-time, after retirement, earned income, maybe a pension, as well as your investment income. That's where all of those sources are going to come from. That's what I mean by a withdrawal rate.
So say we have a decent withdrawal rate and we don't really need to use the money from Social Security benefits for our daily living. Let's say that you've managed my portfolio and I'm getting ready to retire, and I've got a large enough amount where Social Security, I don't have to rely on that at all, but that's going to come in. So I wait till I'm 70, I take the max amount that I can take out. So that money is now income. So now I want to do is say, Pete, I want to put this money away to continue to invest this, but I'm going to be taking the money out of my investments, but I want to take the income that I'm having from Social Security and put it into something aggressive to try to offset what I'm pulling out.
When you're withdrawing from an investment, you're taking what you need at that point in time. So you always want to start with the sources of income that are going to come no matter what. For example, Social Security, that's going to be deposited in your account every month. It's going to show up on your tax return every year. If you have a required minimum distribution from an IRA, that's going to be income that's going to have to come out of your IRA. It's going to have to be income tax, and it's going to be on your tax return every single year. So we start with those figures. And is that enough total income to support your lifestyle? And if it is, if it's more than enough, well, then maybe you have some excess income. Just because you take money out of your IRA and a minimum distribution doesn't mean you can't turn around and invest it the exact same way it was before it came out of the IRA. IRS just wants to collect their income taxes on it. So that's where that money, has to, essentially go from bucket A to bucket B, could own the same stock as it did before. It's just going to be in an after tax, a non IRA account at that point in time. So you want to trigger as little taxable income as possible. You don't want to be taking money from your investments that you don't have to spend because you have it coming from some other source that's already been taxed. And we see this often is people will withdraw from certain accounts or certain buckets of investments for some mental reason that they've decided. And it's not a bad, wrong reason. It's just the reason that they've elected and what makes sense in their, what I call mental accounting. But when you sit down and look at the tax return, sometimes we get the same total income, but not withdraw it from, this account because it's already coming out of this other account. And so therefore that's really what those types of situations, we're looking at how you're going to be income taxed, and we want to manage the total net income that you're going to have. And if we can reduce the taxable income and still put the same amount of money in your pocket that you can spend and live on, that's really the key that we're trying to drive to.
I see. So you would probably advise somebody, say, hey, look, if this Social Security is coming in, if you don't need it, then take less of a distribution from your investments than you had anticipated. Because
Absolutely. Why wouldn't you? Because you're being taxed on the Social Security that is coming to you anyway, or the other withdrawals that you make might be elevating your taxable income, so more of your Social Security is subject to tax. So we want to start with that income like Social Security first. That's money you're going to spend. And then your investments are going to support above and beyond that. We don't want to start in the other direction because then we're going to drive taxes. We're going to drive, we're going to change the purpose or time horizon of an investment from being longer term or at least intermediate term to being shorter term when that isn't necessary. And we're going to miss opportunity. And we're also going to have some income tax exposure that may not be necessary.
Let's pivot this conversation about living longer, not living longer than needed, but living longer just because we're living longer. And when it related to financial planning, inflation is a big deal. So it's hard to predict. And obviously working with you is a smart thing to do. But how do you actually put in inflation into these calculations? Because it just seems like it's a number that we're guessing at, isn't it?
I don't think inflation's a number we're guessing at so much as it's a number that we need to include and incorporate. And what I mean by that is whatever we spend today, it's going to cost more in the future. So I think we have to start with that, obviously. And how much more is really the question. And inflation doesn't go in a nice, orderly fashion. It tends to go in kind of a lumpy way. So I was looking back in 2022, a stamp I think was like 39 cents, and it's 73 cents now. And so it's had a better than 3% inflation rate over that period of time. However, if I just go back 7 years, it's gone up over 5% in the last 7 years. In other words, inflation was, 2, 3, 4% over time, but lately it's been significantly higher than that. So that's where it comes into play is we have to think about how much more you're going to be spending. And, if you're familiar with the rule of 72, if we take the number 72 and we divide it by a rate of return. So let's say we think we're going to earn 7%. Well, divide 7 into 72 and, it's about 10. And that means it will take 10 years for your money to double. Or let's use that as a rate of inflation. It's going to take, that long for your costs to go, to double. And so if we're looking at 3% inflation, it might take, 18 to 20 or over 20 years to, for your costs to go higher. So if you're retiring at 60 things might cost twice as much by the time you're 85. On the other hand, if inflation's 5%, if we take that into account, things might, the cost of things might double in 12 or, 13 years. So that's where we have to keep that into account, is that those costs are definitely rising and we have to use some reasonable approach. And I always say a financial plan, in order to serve you well, it's like a garden. You have to constantly be tending it. You have to constantly be touching and rechecking and refiguring your financial plan. We make assumptions today for the next 20, 30 years, and then 5 years go by. So we're going to start from 5 years from now and make projections for 20 years from that point and so forth. So our starting point is constantly moving forward. Our assumptions or our assumed reality become the real numbers in the future. And that's how we prepare for that. Is some years things are going to go up and cost a little bit more than we thought. Some years they're going to be right on the money, and some years maybe not as much as expected, but we're in the ballpark. And that's really what financial planning is it's not precise, but it is giving you the opportunity to be well prepared and being able to pivot and adjust for whatever the future may bring.
Yeah, so like financial planning isn't really, it's not just a one time, it's a moving target. And you're saying, hey, if we're planning for 5%, if we ever get to a point where inflation is at 50%, there's a lot of other things that we should be worried about than our retirement at that point, I believe.
There's a lot going on there at that point. That's a good point. But you're absolutely right. Yes. So inflation at this higher rate, in the 90s, we would say, if you look back, inflation's been averaging about 5%. Well, from the 90s well into the early 2000s, the inflation was much less than that. And so 2 or 3% inflation, 3% seemed a little bit of a high number to use. Now, in the past several years, it seems like we're kind of back to that 5% number again. I don't know that that's sustainable. We're starting to see that bend, back down to a more traditional number, call it, 3%. But we need to be prepared for that. And the big thing that people will spend money on later is healthcare. And that does seem to be rising more than inflation. So there are things that we spend our money on today that are going up more modestly with, we'll call it general inflation. Healthcare might cost more later. But we also, as we age, won't do all of the same things that we're doing today, and we might just cut certain things out, and just maybe we won't travel as much or take as long of a car ride across country and fill up our gas tank as much. So some of the things we spend our money on, we'll spend less just because we're not, doing as much of those things. On the other hand, like healthcare, some of those things are going to cost more. So if we're using a historically accurate reflection of inflation, I think that's a really good way to consider what you're going to need in the future and how to be well prepared for it.
As a way to wrap up this podcast, I think a good thing to do right now would be to ask you, as a financial planner, what are some of the things that you would recommend that people do, or steps that individuals can take to adapt to the unexpected longevity of their lives?
You always have to, if you read any, books, Ben Franklin wrote a book called The Secret to Wealth. The Richest Man in Babylon is another little thin book to pick up. I would say all of these little novelettes or little books, I don't know what you would call them, but the secret to wealth is you don't spend more than you make. And as simple as that, if don't read The Richest Man in Babylon, that's what it's going to tell you. But that, I think, is really very critical, is that if you have a manageable withdrawal rate and you are spending from your investments in a manageable, what I would call sustainable way, that is something that you can do over time. And I think you can invest in a way that is predictable and should stay within a range of what you expect. And you'll be able to cut back spending or adjust how you're invested a little bit here or there. You don't have to completely, erase the chalkboard and start all over again. That's really the best way about this, is you have to just plan accordingly, and don't plan that you're going to live as high and, high spending and high life as absolutely possible, or more than you've ever done in your life. How do you sustain the life that you're accustomed to? And what's the probability that that's going to be within the range? And that's what good planning is really all about, is just staying within that comfortable range and feeling confident that things are going to go pretty much according to plan. I'll say stay in the ballpark. Thank you for listening. And if our discussion resonates with you, let's start a conversation about what matters most to you. Go to goodfinancial.com, click contact, and schedule a 30-minute chat. I'd love to hear from you.